I was a shadow. My sister was a golden child. I worked hard to start her own business. She demanded money from me, but karma came true. I never thought I'd be sharing my story here, but I feel like I need to get this off my chest. Maybe some of you can relate, or maybe you'll just think it is one big mess. But it's my mess, and I've been living it for as long as I can remember. I grew up in a house where my sister Emma was the golden child. She could do no wrong, at least according to my parents. It was like they were blind to anything else when it came to her. My mom, Lisa, and my dad, Richard, would bend over backward to make sure she had everything she ever wanted. I was the afterthought, the background noise in their little family fantasy. Let me paint you a picture. It was Emma's 17th birthday, and the house was filled with gifts, decorations, and all the treats you could imagine. You'd think it was a royal coronation or something. My parents were all over her, showering her with affection and praise. It was nauseating. And there I was, standing by the doorway, just watching it all unfold. I hadn't eaten all day because, well, who cared if Jason got fed? I asked my mom if I could have something to eat, but she just brushed me off like I was a fly buzzing around her perfect day. Get it yourself, Jason. We were celebrating Emma's birthday, she said, not even looking at me. That is how it always was. Emma was the sun, and I was the shadow nobody noticed. I think the only time they remembered I existed was when they needed someone to blame for something that went wrong. It wasn't long before I learned to just keep my head down and stay out of the way. But school was no better. I wish I could say it was an escape, but it was more like another circle of hell. I was the target for every bully who needed to feel better about themselves. They'd taunt me, push me around, and make sure I knew just how pathetic they thought I was. There was one day that really stuck with me, though. I was walking down the hallway, trying to keep my head down and avoid any trouble. But of course, trouble found me. This group of bullies, real pieces of work, cornered me by the lockers. One of them sneered at me, and I could feel my stomach drop. "Look at him, always so pathetic," one of them spat out, his voice dripping with contempt. Another one stepped forward and punched me right in the gut. "Why don't you just disappear?" he said, like I was some kind of disease they wanted to get rid of. I tried to walk away, but I could barely breathe, let alone stand up to them. The tears welled up in my eyes, and I hated myself for it. But what could I do? I was just a kid, alone and beaten down by everyone around me. That night, lying on the thin mattress in my tiny bedroom, I stared up at the ceiling and made myself a promise. I was going to get out. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I started saving every penny I could get my hands on, hiding it away in a small jar under my bed. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was my ticket to freedom. Just a little more, and I am out of here. I did tell myself every night as I added whatever I could to that jar. When I turned 18, I finally made my move. I got a job at a local bakery, working for a kind old man who didn't care about my past or my family. He just saw that I was willing to work hard, and that was enough for him. I threw myself into the job, working long hours, learning everything I could about baking. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something right. The bakery became my sanctuary. The warm smell of bread and pastries, the quiet rhythm of kneading dough, it was like I could finally breathe. The old man, who I just called Baker, would pat me on the back and say, "Good job, Jason, keep it up." And I did. I worked my ass off, and slowly but surely, I started to save enough money to move out on my own. Eventually, I found a small, modest apartment. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom place with a tiny kitchen, but it was mine. I kept working at the bakery, and before I knew it, I had my own little cake business on the side. I'd take orders from customers and bake cakes from my apartment's kitchen. It wasn't too glamorous, but it was honest work, and it made me happy. One night, I was sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by cakes ready for delivery the next day, and I got a call from a customer. They wanted a rush order for a party the next day. I was tired, but I couldn't say no. This was my business, my future, and I was determined to make it work. "I'll have that order ready for you by tomorrow." "Thanks for your business," I said, smiling as I hung up the phone. I was in the middle of icing a cake when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to pick it up. I wish I hadn't. "Jason, it's Emma," the voice on the other end said, and my heart sank. It had been years since I had heard from her. After I moved out, I cut off contact with my family. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way I could start to heal. Hearing her voice brought back all those memories I tried so hard to bury. "What do you want, Emma?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated for a moment before she spoke. "Mom is dead," she said flatly, without a trace of emotion. For a second, I didn't know what to say. I hadn't seen or spoken to Mom since I left, and now she was gone. It felt surreal, like a punch to the gut I wasn't ready for. But there was something about Emma's tone that set off alarm bells in my head. "What happened?" I finally managed to ask. "Heart attack," Emma replied. "It was sudden. She was alone. No one found her for a couple of days." I swallowed hard, trying to process what she was telling me. But before I could say anything, Emma continued, her voice turning cold. "You're going to help with the funeral costs, Jason. It's only fair. She was your mother, too." I felt the anger bubbling up inside me. Where did she get off thinking she could just waltz back into my life and start making demands? I barely had enough money to keep my business going, let alone pay for a funeral. And after everything they put me through, did she really expect me to just roll over and help her? "I can tell, Emma," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "I have nothing to give." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost picture the sneer on her face. "You better figure something out," she hissed. "Marx is not happy about this, and trust me, you don't want to piss him off." Mark. I hadn't thought about that guy in years, but I remembered him well enough. He was Emma's boyfriend, and a real piece of work. Aggressive, possessive, and not someone you wanted to get on the wrong side of. The fact that Emma was bringing him into this made my stomach churn. "I am sorry, but I can help you," I said firmly, and hung up the phone before she could say anything else. I hoped that would be the end of it, but deep down, I knew better. Emma wasn't going to let this go, and with Mark involved, I knew I was in trouble, but I had no idea just how much trouble was headed my way. A few nights later, I was locking up the bakery when I noticed a car parked across the street. The headlights were off, but I could see the silhouette of two people inside. My heart started to race as I recognized the car. It was Mark S. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I bolted for my apartment, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys to get inside. But they were faster. Just as I got the door open, Mark grabbed me from behind and slammed me against the wall. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of me, and before I could even catch my breath, Emma was in my face, her expression twisted with anger. "You think you can just ignore me, Jason? After everything we've been through?" She spat, her voice filled with venom. I tried to push her away, but Mark tightened his grip, pinning me against the wall. "You are going to pay up one way or another," he growled, his breath hot against my ear. And then they started beating me. Mark's fists came down on me like hammers, each blow sending waves of pain through my body. Emma didn't hold back either, kicking and slapping me as if she were trying to erase me from existence. I don't know how long it lasted, minutes, hours. It all blurred together in a haze of pain and fear. When they finally stopped, I was barely conscious, crumpled on the ground in front of my apartment door. Mark leaned down, his face inches from mine, and hissed, "You better have that money by the end of the week, or this will feel like a love tap compared to what's coming next." Emma stood there, looking down at me with a mixture of satisfaction and disdain. "Consider this a warning, little brother," she said coldly, before turning on her heel and walking away with Mark. I don't remember how I managed to drag myself inside, but I did. Every inch of my body was screaming in pain, and I could barely think straight. I collapsed onto the floor and passed out, too broken to do anything else. When I woke up the next morning, the reality of what had happened hit me like a freight train. I could barely move. My face was swollen, and I was covered in bruises. I knew I needed help, but I didn't want to go to the hospital. I couldn't afford it, and I didn't want to risk running into anyone who might recognize me. But as the day wore on, I realized I didn't have a choice. The pain was getting worse, and I could feel something wasn't right. Reluctantly, I called an ambulance and got myself to the ER. The doctors were shocked at the state I was in. They admitted me right away, hooking me up to all kinds of machines and running tests. The next few days were a blur of doctors, nurses, and painkillers. I was in bad shape, but I was alive, and that was all that mattered. I thought I could keep the assault quiet, that I could just heal up and move on without anyone knowing what happened. But that plan went out the window when the police showed up at my hospital room. "Mr. Carter, we need to ask you a few questions," one of the officers said as he entered the room, his expression serious. I knew I couldn't lie. They had already seen my injuries, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. So I told them everything. About the call from Emma, the threats, the attack, it all came spilling out in one painful confession. They took my statement and promised to investigate. I didn't have much hope that anything would come of it, but at least I'd done my part. I just wanted to get out of the hospital, go home, and try to pick up the pieces of my life. I spent a week in the hospital, and every day felt like an eternity. The doctors patched me up as best they could, but the bruises and broken ribs would take time to heal. They kept me on painkillers that dulled the agony, but left me in a fog, unable to think clearly. When I wasn't sleeping, I was staring at the ceiling, replaying the attack over and over in my mind. The police came back a few times to ask more questions, but I could tell they were just going through the motions. They took my story seriously, but I wasn't naive enough to think they'd prioritize a family dispute over everything else on their plates. Still, I gave them everything I had: descriptions of the attack, details about Emma and Mark, and even the threats they made. Part of me hoped they'd actually do something, but a bigger part of me just wanted it all to be over. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, they discharged me. I was still sore and moving slowly, but at least I was out of that sterile room. I went back to my apartment feeling like a ghost. Everything was just as I'd left it: the cakes on the table, the order forms, the tools of my trade, but it all felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. I tried to get back to work, but every movement sent pain shooting through my body. Kneading dough, lifting trays, even standing for too long, it all became a struggle. My savings were already running low from the hospital bills, and I knew I couldn't afford to let my business slip. But the reality was, I wasn't sure how long I could keep going like this. And then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. At first, I thought it was just another bill. But when I opened it, my blood ran cold. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in harsh, angry letters. "This isn't over." There was no signature, no name, but I didn't need one to know who it was from. Emma and Mark were still out there, and they weren't done with me yet. Panic set in. I felt like a cornered animal, trapped with no way out. I wanted to run, to disappear, but where would I go? I couldn't afford to leave, and even if I could, I had nowhere to run to. I was stuck, and they knew it. I started looking over my shoulder every time I stepped outside. Every car that passed by, every stranger who looked at me too long, it all felt like a threat. I barely slept, jumping at every noise, every creak in the floorboards. I kept the lights on all night, afraid of what might be lurking in the dark. The worst part was, I couldn't tell anyone. I had no one to turn to, no friends, no family who would care. I was completely alone, and that isolation only fed my fear. Days turned into weeks, and I felt myself unraveling. My business started to suffer. Customers complained about late orders, about cakes that weren't up to my usual standards. But what could I do? I was barely holding on as it was. And then the court summons arrived. Apparently, the police had taken my case more seriously than I'd thought. They had enough evidence to charge Emma and Mark with assault, and the trial date was set. I was stunned. I never expected it to go this far. But now, I was being dragged back into the nightmare, forced to face them again in a courtroom. The day of the trial, I felt like I was walking to my execution. My body was still a wreck, but I managed to put on a suit and make myself look somewhat presentable. I arrived at the courthouse early, trying to steel myself for what was coming. When I entered the courtroom, my heart nearly stopped. There they were, Emma and Mark, sitting with their lawyer at the defense table. Emma looked different than I remembered. Gone was the confidence, the entitlement. She looked tired, worn down, and a little scared. Mark, on the other hand, was as menacing as ever, his eyes fixed on me with a look that sent chills down my spine. I took my place at the witness stand, trying to keep my voice steady as I recounted everything that had happened. The defense lawyer, a smug-looking man in a sharp suit, tried to tear me apart, questioning my credibility, bringing up our past conflicts as if that somehow justified what they did to me. "Isn't it true, Mr. Carter, that you've had a history of disagreements with your sister?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. I looked him straight in the eye and replied, "It's true, but that doesn't justify what happened." The prosecutor, thankfully, was on my side. She presented the video footage from a security camera outside my apartment, grainy, but clear enough to see the brutal assault. The jury watched in silence, their faces grim as they saw what had been done to me. Even the defense lawyer faltered as the evidence mounted. Emma wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes down, her hands trembling in her lap. Mark, however, glared at me with pure hatred. I could feel his rage from across the room, and I knew that, guilty or not, this wasn't over. The trial dragged on for days, but in the end, the verdict was delivered. Emma was found guilty of assault, along with Mark. The judge's voice rang out in the silent courtroom. The court finds the defendant guilty of assault. Sentencing will be held next week. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was tinged with exhaustion. I was free, but at what cost? I looked over at Emma, who was sitting there, devastated, while Mark seethed beside her. My sister, the golden child, the one who had always been everything to my parents, now she was a criminal, facing the consequences of her actions. As I left the courtroom, I spotted my mother, Lisa, sitting in the audience. She looked like a shell of the woman I once knew. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow, and she was surrounded by empty bottles of alcohol. The sight of her broke something inside me. This was the family I had tried so hard to escape, and now I was free, but utterly alone. I walked out of the courthouse and into the cold light of day, unsure of what the future held. All I knew was that I had survived, and that had to count for something. But the scars, physical and emotional, would be with me forever. After the trial, I tried to go back to my life, but nothing felt the same. My body was healing, but my mind was a mess. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus' face twisted with rage, or Emma's hollow stare as the verdict was read. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really over, that somehow they'd find a way to make me pay for what I'd done. I threw myself into my work at the bakery, hoping that staying busy would keep the nightmares at bay. I spent long hours in the kitchen, baking cake after cake, trying to recapture the joy I used to feel when I worked. But the joy was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that never left me. Every noise made me jump, every knock at the door sent my heart racing. I was living in a state of constant fear, and it was wearing me down. My business, which had once been my pride and joy, was struggling. Customers were starting to notice that I wasn't the same. I missed deadlines, made mistakes in orders, and I could see the disappointment in their eyes when they picked up their cakes. I was letting them down, and it killed me. But I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix myself. The sentencing hearing for Emma and Mark was looming, and as much as I wanted to forget about it, I knew I couldn't. I had to be there, to see it through to the end. But the thought of facing them again made me sick to my stomach. I didn't know if I could handle it. A few days before the hearing, I received another letter in the mail. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a letter from my mother. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. We hadn't spoken in years, not since I left home, but curiosity got the better of me, and I tore the envelope open. Inside was a short note, written in my mother's shaky handwriting. It read, "Jason, I know I haven't been the mother you needed. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. Please, if you can find it in your heart, come see me before it is too late. Love, Mom." I stared at the note, feeling a swirl of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Anger, sadness, guilt, they all crashed over me at once. Part of me wanted to crumple up the letter and throw it away, to leave the past where it belonged. But another part of me, a part I'd tried to bury, felt a tug of something else. Maybe it was pity, or maybe it was just the remnants of the love I'd once felt for her. Either way, I knew I had to see her, if for no other reason than to get some closure. I waited until the day before the sentencing to visit her. Her house was a wreck, the lawn overgrown, the paint peeling off the walls. It was like the house itself had given up, much like my mother had. I stood on the porch for a long time staring at the door, before finally working up the nerve to knock. It took a while, but eventually she opened the door. I barely recognized her. The years hadn't been kind to her. She was thinner than I remembered, her skin pale and her eyes sunken. The smell of alcohol wafted out from the house, and I could see the empty bottles littering the floor behind her. Jason, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom, I replied, unsure of what else to say. She stepped aside, letting me into the house. The inside was even worse than I imagined. It was like she had stopped caring about anything. The furniture was covered in dust, and there were piles of dirty clothes and dishes everywhere. It was a far cry from the clean, orderly home I remembered from my childhood. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where ID sat so many years ago, watching Emma receive all the love and attention while I was ignored. The memories flooded back, but I pushed them aside, focusing on the woman in front of me. I got your letter, I said, breaking the awkward silence. She nodded, looking down at her hands. I didn't know if you'd come, she admitted. I wouldn't have blamed you if you didn't. I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to tell her off, to scream at her for everything she'd put me through. But looking at her now, so small and broken, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Why did you write it? I asked instead. She sighed, running a hand through her thinning hair. I've had a lot of time to think, Jason, about everything. About how I treated you, about how I let Emma get away with so much. I was a terrible mother, and I am sorry. Her words hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken pain. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't help feeling like it was too little, too late. Why now? I pressed. Why are you sorry now? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked at me with a desperation that broke my heart. Because I am dying, Jason. The doctors found something, a tumor. They say it is too late to do anything. I don't have much time left. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I didn't know what to say, what to feel. Anger, sadness, pity. It was all mixed up inside me, and I couldn't make sense of any of it. I'm sorry, I finally managed to say, though the words felt hollow. She nodded, wiping away her tears. I don't want your pity, Jason. I just wanted you to know that I am sorry, and that I love you. I've always loved you, even if I didn't show it. I didn't know if I could believe that, but I could see that she believed it, and maybe that was enough. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything unsaid between us pressing down on me. Finally, I stood up to leave. I have to go, I said, my voice strained. But thank you for telling me. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with regret. Take care of yourself, Jason. And please, if you can, forgive me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just nodded and walked out the door, leaving her behind, alone in that empty house. The next day, I went to the sentencing hearing, feeling like a ghost of myself. Emma and Mark were there, both looking defeated. The judge handed down their sentences. Emma got 2 years in prison, while Mark received 5. I watched as they were led away in handcuffs, and for the first time, I felt a sense of closure. It was over. Finally, it was over. But as I left the courthouse, I couldn't shake the image of my mother, alone in that house, waiting to die. She had asked for forgiveness, but I didn't know if I could give it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But as I walked away, I realized that the weight I'd been carrying for so long felt just a little bit lighter. After the sentencing, I expected to feel some sort of relief, but instead, there was just an emptiness, like a wound that hadn't quite healed. I knew that Emma and Mark were locked away, unable to hurt me anymore, but the scars they left, both physical and emotional, were still fresh, still raw. I tried to move on, focusing on my business, but it was harder than I thought. The cakes I used to bake with such love and care now felt like chores, just another task to get through the day. The orders kept coming, and I filled them, but my heart wasn't in it. I started to wonder if it ever would be again. A few weeks after the sentencing, I got another letter. This time, it was from the prison where Emma was being held. I almost didn't open it. The thought of reading anything from her made my stomach turn, but curiosity got the better of me. I ripped open the envelope and pulled out the letter. It was short, just a few lines scrawled in her familiar handwriting. Jason, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve your forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I am sorry. Not just for what happened that night, but for everything. I don't know if we'll ever speak again, but I hope you can find some peace. Emma. I stared at the letter for a long time, not sure how to feel. Emma had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. But now, she was admitting her mistakes, acknowledging the pain she'd caused. It was something I never thought I'd see, and it left me feeling more conflicted than ever. I thought about visiting her, But every time I got close to picking up the phone or writing a reply, I hesitated. The wounds were still too fresh, the memories too painful. Maybe one day, I'd be able to face her again. But not now. Not yet. Instead, I threw myself into work. I couldn't afford to let my business fail, not after everything I'd been through. Slowly, I started to get back into the rhythm of baking. The kitchen became my refuge once again, a place where I could lose myself in the process and forget about the past, even if just for a little while. The orders picked up, and I started to get new customers, people who had heard about my cakes and wanted to try them for themselves. It was a small comfort, but it helped me feel like I was regaining some control over my life. One day, I received a particularly large order for a wedding cake. It was the biggest project I'd taken on since everything happened, and I was nervous about whether I could pull it off. But I needed the challenge. I needed to prove to myself that I could still do this. I spent days planning and preparing, making sure every detail was perfect. The cake had to be just right. It was for a young couple who were starting their life together, and I wanted to make something that would reflect the joy and love of that occasion. As I worked, I found myself thinking about my own life, about how different things might have been if my family had been different, if we'd been able to find some semblance of love and support instead of the toxic mess we'd lived in. I thought about Emma and Mark, and even my mother, and I wondered if any of us could have found happiness if things had gone another way. But those thoughts were fleeting, replaced by the task at hand. I focused on the cake, pouring all my energy into making it as beautiful as I could. It felt good to create something positive, something that would bring joy to others. When the cake was finally finished, I stood back and looked at it, feeling a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was a towering confection, decorated with intricate sugar flowers and delicate piping. It was the kind of cake I used to dream of making when I first started out, and seeing it there, complete, made me realize that maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. Delivering the cake to the wedding was bittersweet. The bride and groom were overjoyed, their faces lighting up when they saw it. They thanked me profusely, and as I watched them, hand in hand, I felt a pang of longing. I wondered if I'd ever find that kind of happiness for myself, if I'd ever be able to move past the pain and build a life worth living. The wedding brought back memories of my own family, of the love and joy that had always seemed just out of reach. But instead of dwelling on the past, I decided to focus on the future. I didn't know what it held, but I knew I had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Over the next few months, I slowly started to rebuild my life. I found a therapist who helped me work through the trauma, and I started to open up to the possibility of reconnecting with people. It wasn't easy. I'd spent so long isolated, trapped in my own pain, but I knew I couldn't stay that way forever. I even started to consider the idea of visiting my mother again. Her letter had been on my mind ever since I read it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was unfinished business between us. She was dying, and as much as I wanted to stay angry, I knew I'd regret it if I didn't at least try to make peace with her before she was gone. One evening, after a long day at the bakery, I found myself standing outside her house again. It looked even worse than before, like it was slowly crumbling into the ground. I didn't know what I was doing there, but something had drawn me back, some need for closure that I couldn't ignore. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments she answered. She looked even weaker than the last time had seen her, her face gaunt and her eyes dull. But when she saw me, a flicker of life returned to her gaze. "Jason," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Hi, Mom," I replied, trying to keep my own emotions in check. She stepped aside, letting me in. The house was still a mess, but I didn't care about that anymore. We sat down at the same kitchen table, and this time, the silence between us wasn't as heavy. It was still awkward, still tinged with pain, but there was a sense of understanding now, a shared grief that we were both trying to come to terms with. "I didn't think you'd come back," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I almost didn't," I replied honestly. "But I've been thinking about what you said, about forgiveness." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know I don't deserve it, Jason, but I'm so grateful that you are here." We talked for a long time, about everything and nothing. I didn't forgive her completely, not yet, but being there with her, sharing that moment, felt like a step in the right direction. I didn't know how much time she had left, I continued to focus on my business, and little by little, things started to improve. My customers began to notice the change too. The cakes I made were no longer just tasks to get through the day, they were creations I took pride in, something I put my heart into once again. The orders kept coming, and with each one, I felt a little more like myself. One day, I got a call from a woman who wanted a cake for her daughter's birthday. She sounded stressed, explaining that the previous baker she'd hired had fallen through, and now she was in a bind. "I know it is last minute," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "But is there any way you could help?" Normally, I wouldn't have taken on such a short notice order, but something about the way she asked reminded me of the times I'd been in a similar position, scrambling to make things work when everything seemed to be falling apart. I couldn't say no. "Of course," I told her. "I'll make sure it's ready in time." The relief in her voice was palpable. "Thank you so much. My daughter is turning 6, and she's been dreaming about this cake for months. You have no idea how much this means to us." I spent the next few days working on that cake, making sure every detail was perfect. It wasn't just about the money, it was about helping someone, making a little girl's birthday special. When I delivered the cake to their house, the look on that little girl's face made all the late nights and stress worth it. She squealed with delight when she saw the cake, her eyes wide with amazement. "Mommy, it's exactly what I wanted," she exclaimed, hugging her mother's leg. The woman looked at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You really saved the day." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. I'm just glad I could help. As I drove back to my apartment, I realized that this was what I had been missing: connection. For so long, I shut myself off from the world, too wrapped up in my own pain to see beyond it. But helping that woman, seeing the joy on her daughter's face, made me realize that there was more to life than just surviving. There was still good in the world, and I wanted to be a part of it. The experience encouraged me to open up more, to try and connect with people in ways I hadn't before. I started attending local events, meeting other small business owners, and even making a few friends along the way. It wasn't easy. I'd spent so long isolated that socializing felt foreign to me, but each small step made the world feel a little less lonely. One of the people I met during this time was a woman named Rachel. She owned a flower shop down the street from the bakery, and we'd run into each other a few times at community events. She was kind, with a warm smile and a laugh that could brighten anyone's day. We started talking more and more, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations. There was something about her that made me feel at ease, like I could finally let my guard down. One evening, after closing up the bakery, I found myself wandering over to her flower shop. The door was still open, and I could see her inside, arranging a bouquet of roses. I hesitated for a moment before walking in. "Hey, Rachel," I said, trying to sound casual. She looked up, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Jason, what brings you by?" I shrugged, suddenly feeling a little nervous. "Just thought I'd say hi, see how you were doing." She smiled, setting the bouquet aside. "I am doing well, thanks. How about you?" I thought about everything that had happened: the trial, my mother, the long road to recovery, and realized that, for the first time in a long while, I could honestly say, I'm doing better. We ended up talking for hours that night. Rachel had a way of making me feel comfortable, like I could tell her anything without fear of judgment. We talked about our businesses, our lives, and even shared some of our past struggles. She told me about the difficulties she'd faced starting her flower shop, the times she almost gave up, and how she'd found the strength to keep going. "It sounds like we've both been through the ringer," she said with a chuckle. But there was a depth in her eyes that told me she understood what it was like to carry heavy burdens. "Yeah," I agreed, feeling a connection with her that I hadn't felt with anyone in a long time. "But I guess that is what makes us stronger, right?" She nodded, her smile softening. "Absolutely. And it's as nice to have someone to talk to about it all." From that night on, Rachel and I grew closer. We started spending more time together, grabbing coffee in the mornings or sharing dinner after work. She became someone I could rely on, someone who made the world feel a little less daunting, and in return, I tried to be the same for her. But as things got better, there was still one thing weighing on my mind: my mother. Her health was declining rapidly, and I knew that if I wanted to find closure, I needed to do it soon. I couldn't keep putting it off, hoping the problem would solve itself. I had to face it head on. One evening, After a particularly good day at the bakery, I decided it was time. I called Rachel and told her about my decision. She listened quietly, offering her support as always, and told me that she'd be there for me no matter what happened. The next day, I visited my mother again. The house was in even worse shape than before, but I didn't let it deter me. I found her in the living room, sitting in her old armchair looking frail and tired. She smiled weakly when she saw me, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Jason," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You came back." "I did," I replied, sitting down across from her. "I wanted to talk to you." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for mine. "I am glad you did." We talked for a long time that day. She told me more about her regrets, about how she wished she could go back and change things. She apologized over and over again, and this time, I could see that she truly meant it. She was a woman at the end of her life, trying to make peace with the mistakes she'd made. And as much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, I found that I couldn't anymore. I'd spent so long carrying that weight, but sitting there with her, seeing the pain in her eyes, I realized that holding on to it wasn't helping anyone, least of all me. So I forgave her. It wasn't easy, and it didn't erase everything that had happened, but it was a start. We both cried, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of relief. The wall I'd built around myself was starting to crumble, and in its place, there was something new, something that felt like hope. When I left that day, I knew that I'd done the right thing. My mother didn't have much time left, but I was at peace with that. We'd made amends, and I knew that whatever happened next, I'd be okay. A few weeks later, she passed away. It wasn't unexpected, but it still hit me hard. I leaned on Rachel during that time, and she was there for me every step of the way. She even helped me plan a small, quiet funeral for my mother, something simple but meaningful. As I stood by her grave, I felt a mix of emotions: grief, yes, but also a sense of closure. My relationship with my mother had been complicated, messy, and full of pain, but in the end, we'd found some semblance of peace. And that was enough. Life went on after that. I continued to work at the bakery, building my business and my life one day at a time. Rachel and I grew even closer, and as time passed, I started to realize that I wanted more than just friendship with her. She'd become a bright spot in my life, someone who made me believe in happiness again. One evening, as we sat in her flower shop talking about our day, I took her hand in mine. "Rachel," I said, my heart pounding in my chest, "I think I'm falling for you." She looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise, and then she smiled a smile that lit up her entire face. "Jason," she whispered, "I think I'm falling for you too."